She just wanted to apologize for the spilled coffee. But when she resigned, the arrogant millionaire did the unthinkable. He pulled her close and kissed her in front of everyone. If you enjoy love stories and romance, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment. We post videos like this every day. Now, continuing. The first glance between Louisa and Richard pierced the charged air of the operating room like a silent lightning bolt. She, with her 27 years newly completed, unruly brown hair hidden beneath her surgical cap, and attentive eyes fixed on the patient. He, 40 years old, impeccable posture, a contained expression, and a gaze that seemed to analyze everything around him with millimeter precision. On that summer night at St. Francis Hospital in London, while the air conditioning battled the suffocating January heat, neither of them would ever imagine that emergency surgery would be just the beginning of something much bigger than both. Louisa Miller was one of the most promising residents in the cardiothoracic surgery program. Born and raised on the outskirts of Croydon, she lost her parents in an accident when she was just 12 years old. She grew up under the care of her grandmother, a seamstress who sacrificed everything so her granddaughter could study. With scholarships and weekend jobs, Louisa managed to graduate in medicine from University College London, and now she was one step away from realizing her dream, becoming a cardiac surgeon. Every 36-hour shift, every sleepless night studying protocols, every drop of bitter coffee she drank to stay awake. It was all worth it when she stepped into that operating room. Richard Anderson was not just the executive director of St. Francis Hospital. He was the heir to the Anderson healthcare empire, a network of private hospitals that dominated the premium healthcare market in the UK. Educated at the best universities abroad, with an MBA from Harvard and a specialization in hospital management, he returned to the UK to take over the family business after his father's death. Under his cold and calculating management, the group expanded even further, incorporating laboratories, clinics, and diagnostic centers. The specialized press called him the business surgeon. Not for his medical skill, though he was a trained doctor, but for the precision with which he cut costs and restructured operations. In the operating room that night, the two met by chance. The patient, a senator, had suffered an acute heart attack during a dinner in Kensington. Richard, who normally didn't set foot in the patient care area, had been called in for political and institutional reasons. Louisa was on call when the case arrived, and by a series of coincidences, she ended up being the first to attend to the politician. "We need to prepare him for an emergency angioplasty," Louisa said firmly, as she checked the patient's vital signs. "Who is in charge of the case?" Richard asked, entering the room unceremoniously, adjusting his navy blue tie that matched his impeccably cut suit. "Dr. Mendoza is the attending physician on call, but he's in another surgery. I am Dr. Louisa Miller, a second-year resident." Richard examined her from head to toe. It wasn't common for a resident to take the lead on such a delicate case, much less speak with such confidence. A resident, Senator Matthews, needs the best possible care, and that's exactly what I'm offering, Louisa replied, without averting her gaze. "Time is crucial in cases like this. If we wait another 10 minutes, the chances of complications increase by 40%. For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. The nursing staff exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke to Richard Anderson like that. However, to everyone's surprise, a slight smile appeared at the corner of his lips. "Proceed, doctor," he said, stepping back. "Show me what you can do." The following hours were of extreme tension. The angioplasty was complicated, with multiple obstructions. Louisa worked with surgical precision, her eyes focused, her hands steady. Richard observed every movement, every decision. What began as oversight gradually transformed into genuine admiration. Behind that executive demeanor, there still existed the doctor who had once dreamed of saving lives. When they finally finished, it was past 3 in the morning. The senator was stable, with a favorable prognosis. Exhausted, Louisa removed her surgical mask and let out a long sigh. "Exceptional work," Richard said, approaching her. "Where did you learn to handle pressure like that?" Louisa smiled wearily. "Growing up without resources on the outskirts teaches you a lot about pressure. Dr. Anderson. Medicine was just the next challenge. Something in that answer hit Richard like a silent punch. There was authenticity in her, a rare quality in his world of superficial and self-serving relationships. I'd like to discuss the case more calmly. Can we have coffee at the hospital cafeteria? That coffee stretched for over an hour. They talked about the clinical case, about surgical techniques, about the challenges of modern medicine. Louisa spoke passionately about her dream of creating a cardiac care program for underprivileged communities. Richard, normally reserved, found himself sharing frustrations about the bureaucratization of healthcare and the constant pressure for financial results. My mother, Eleanor, measures success in quarterly charts and shareholder returns. He confessed, sometimes I wonder if we're truly in the healthcare business or just the money business. When they parted, dawn was breaking over London. A handshake that lasted a second longer than necessary sealed the first of many encounters. In the following weeks, Richard began to appear frequently in cardiology rounds. Officially, he was evaluating internal processes. Unofficially, he was looking for Louisa. Casual encounters in the elevator, in the cafeteria, in the hospital corridors became more frequent. Quick conversations evolved into hurried lunches between consultations. Colleagues began to notice, and rumors quickly spread through the aseptic corridors of St. Francis. Louisa tried to stay focused. Her residency demanded total dedication, and getting involved with the hospital's CEO seemed, at the very least, complicated. But there was something about Richard that intrigued her, perhaps the contrast between the cold executive everyone feared and the contemplative man she was beginning to know. On a particularly difficult night, after losing a young patient on the operating table, Louisa took refuge on the hospital's rooftop terrace. The tears she had held back throughout the procedure finally flowed freely. They say it gets easier with time, Richard said, appearing silently behind her. It's a lie. We just learn to carry it better. How did you find me here? This was my refuge too. In my early years, when I still saw patients. Without thinking, she turned and hugged him, seeking comfort in human warmth. He hesitated for a second, unaccustomed to physical contact, before wrapping his arms around her. They remained like that for a few minutes, professional boundaries dissolving in the night air of London. The first kiss happened right there, under the starry sky of the UK's largest metropolis. A hesitant kiss at first, which quickly transformed into something more urgent, as if both were finally releasing a long-contained feeling. When they separated, breathless, the world seemed different. This is a terrible idea, Louisa whispered, still in his arms. The worst possible, Richard agreed, before kissing her again. What followed was a whirlwind. Clandestine meetings in empty break rooms, messages exchanged amidst shifts, glances that said everything when they were in professional meetings. Richard rediscovered passions he thought were dead. Louisa experienced a connection she never imagined possible. In their moments together, social differences, hierarchies, everything disappeared. They were just a man and a woman discovering each other. It was during one of these encounters, in the doctor's lounge in the early hours of the morning, that their relationship reached another level. Amidst kisses and caresses, physical barriers broke. For the first time, Louisa gave herself completely, body and soul. Richard, in turn, felt vulnerable in a way he had never experienced. In the silence of that room, between hospital sheets and the distant sound of heart monitors, something changed forever. I'm falling in love with you, he confessed, caressing her face as he watched the sunrise through the small window, and it terrifies me. Why? Because it wasn't in the plans. None of this was. My entire life was mapped out from birth. The right school, the right university, the right marriage, with the right person from the same social class. And I'm not the right person, Louisa completed, feeling a tightness in her chest. You're the only person who has made me feel alive in years. That makes you the most right of all. For a few weeks, they lived in a bubble of happiness. Richard began to rethink priorities, to dream of changes. Louisa allowed herself to believe that, perhaps, this improbable story could work out. Until Eleanor Anderson entered the scene, matriarch of the Anderson family. Eleanor was the chairwoman of the group's administrative board, Widowed for 10 years, she had transformed grief into absolute power. At 65, she maintained the impeccable elegance of London's high society women, platinum blonde hair always in a bob cut, designer clothes, discreet but extremely expensive jewelry. What few knew was that behind that refined appearance hid a woman who had built an empire by being more ruthless than any man. It was through Richard's secretary that Eleanor learned of the romance. One afternoon, without prior notice, she summoned her son for lunch at the Wolseley, an exclusive restaurant in the Mayfair district. "You look thinner," she commented, analyzing him as she sipped her Chardonnay, "and distracted." "I've been working a lot," Richard replied, suddenly feeling like a teenager caught red-handed. "Work doesn't make a man check his phone every 5 minutes and smile like an idiot." Eleanor placed her glass on the table with studied precision. "I know about the resident, Richard." His blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please, spare me." Louisa Miller, 27 years old, cardiac surgery resident, orphan, raised by her grandmother in modest conditions, intelligent, dedicated, ambitious, all very touching, really. A walking cliché. "How did you—" "I have eyes and ears throughout the hospital, son. Nothing happens without my knowing." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Romances between employees are discouraged, but they happen. Romances between the CEO and a resident are absolutely unacceptable. My personal life is not the board's concern. Everything that affects the reputation of the Anderson Group is the board's concern, especially when it threatens decades of family planning." She paused calculatedly. "You are about to be announced as the new chairman of the British Association of Private Hospitals. The country's largest laboratory group is considering a merger with us, and your ex-fiancée, Veronica, daughter of the Minister of Health, is finally willing to resume your relationship." Richard felt his anger rise. "So that's it? My life as a bargaining chip?" "Your life is your greatest asset, Richard. Use it intelligently." Eleanor opened her Italian leather bag and took out an envelope. "Here are the documents for the full scholarship we are offering Dr. Miller to complete her cardiac surgery residency at Johns Hopkins in the United States, an extraordinary opportunity that very few British citizens receive." "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious. She leaves in 3 weeks. She either accepts this unique opportunity, or she will face a disciplinary board for unethical conduct with a superior. Her career will end before it even begins." "You can't do that." "I can, and I will." Eleanor's eyes, identical to her son's, hardened. "So the choice is yours. End this adolescent romance now and allow her to have a brilliant career far from here, or insist on this madness and watch her professional destruction and your own downfall." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced his penthouse in Belgravia like a caged animal. He drank more than he should have, smashed a crystal glass against the wall, contemplated giving up everything. But at dawn, a terrible certainty settled in. His mother wasn't bluffing. She would destroy Louisa without the slightest remorse. 2 days later, he called Louisa for a conversation in the executive office. "What happened? You disappeared. You didn't answer my messages," she said, concerned by his somber expression. This was a mistake. Richard's voice came out mechanical, rehearsed. "We both knew from the start." "What are you talking about?" "About us, about this relationship. It was a lapse in judgment on my part, a breach of ethical protocol." Louisa felt as if the ground disappeared beneath her feet. "That's not you talking. What happened, Richard?" "Nothing happened. I just regained my common sense." He avoided looking directly into her eyes. "You're in a vulnerable position as a resident. I'm your superior. The situation is untenable. Look into my eyes and tell me you feel nothing for me." Richard finally faced her. For a brief moment, his mask almost fell. Then, he hardened his expression. "I feel I made a mistake in judgment. I feel I let physical attraction cloud my professional discernment, and I feel this needs to end now." The words hit Louisa like physical blows. "It was your mother, wasn't it? She found out about us. This has nothing to do with my family." He opened a folder on the table. "As compensation for the emotional distress, the hospital is offering you a full scholarship to complete your residency at Johns Hopkins." "Compensation?" Her voice faltered. "Are you paying me to leave?" I'm offering an unparalleled professional opportunity." Louisa felt nauseous. The tears she tried to hold back now flowed freely. "I believed in you. I believed that the man I met on the rooftop, who hugged me when I lost a patient, who looked at me as if I were the most precious thing in the world, I believed he was real. That man was an illusion, a lapse in judgment." Richard kept his voice firm, though something inside him was breaking apart. "This is reality, Louisa. We are from different worlds. We always have been." "Coward." The word came out as a pained sigh. "You don't have the courage to fight for what you feel. Perhaps there's nothing to fight for." Louisa stood up, trembling. "You know what's worse? It's not the rejection. It's realizing that I was completely wrong about who you are. I thought that behind that facade of a cold executive there was a real man, but there's nothing there but a puppet manipulated by golden strings." She walked to the door, then stopped and turned one last time. "Keep your scholarship. Keep your empire. Keep your perfect and empty life. I'd rather have my daily struggle with dignity 1,000 times over than spend a single second living this lie you call life." The door closed with a bang that seemed to echo throughout the hospital. Richard remained motionless, his breath caught in his chest. When he finally managed to move, he went to the panoramic window of his office. Down below, he saw Louisa crossing the parking lot, her shoulders slumped in a posture he had never seen before. In that moment, something broke inside Richard Anderson, something that, he feared, could never be fixed. Louisa requested a transfer the next day. She would complete her residency at St. Thomas Hospital, on the other side of the city. In the corridors of St. Francis, rumors multiplied, but they were soon replaced by new scandals, new gossip. Life ran its course, as it always does. For Richard, the days became a grey sequence of meetings, spreadsheets, and fake smiles. He resumed his relationship with Veronica, more out of inertia than desire. He took over the presidency of the British Association of Private Hospitals, completed the merger with the laboratory group, and expanded the Anderson empire. To all intents and purposes, his life was back on track. But at night, alone in his luxurious apartment, he still found himself looking out at the hospital's rooftop terrace through the window, recalling the taste of their first kiss, the feeling of being alive after years of mechanical existence. In his most honest moments, he admitted to himself he would never fully recover from those brief months when he knew true love, only to destroy it with his own hands. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't imagine as he drowned his sorrows in excessive work and superficial relationships, was that a simple photo would change everything again. An image on social media that would turn his life upside down and force him to confront not only his past, but the future he never thought possible. Louisa discovered her pregnancy on a rainy April afternoon, exactly 6 weeks after breaking up with Richard. Dr. Marsh's office, her gynecologist and college friend, seemed strangely silent as she stared at the blood test result. The numbers left no doubt. The morning sickness, the excessive fatigue, the breast tenderness, all the signs that she, as a doctor, should have recognized, but which her mind, perhaps in self-defense, had completely ignored. "Are you okay?" Marcia asked, observing her friend's pale face. "I'm pregnant," Louisa murmured, the words sounding strange in her own voice. "I, Louisa Miller, who planned every step of my life since I was 15, am pregnant in my 2nd year of residency, without a stable relationship, without adequate financial structure." Marcia held her hands firmly. "And what do you intend to do?" The question hung in the air like a sentence. Louisa closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, images formed. A child with eyes identical to Richard's, small hands grasping her lab coat, a child's laughter echoing through the modest apartment where she lived. When she reopened her eyes, there was no hesitation. "I'm going to have this baby," she said, with a certainty that surprised even herself. "Alone, if I have to." "And the father?" Louisa hardened her expression. "He made it clear he didn't want me in his life. I don't need a man who doesn't have the courage to fight for what he feels." "Louisa, don't you think he has a right to know?" "A right?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Richard Anderson is the CEO of a billionaire empire. He has access to the best lawyers in the country. If he knows about this pregnancy, what would stop his family from trying to take my child from me? From suing me for some absurd claim of fraud or extortion? Not all rich men are monsters, Louisa. No, but they're all cowards when it comes to facing powerful mothers and family empires. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. I need to protect this child at all costs, and the only way to do that is to keep Richard away from us. In the following weeks, Louisa reorganized her life with the pragmatic determination that had always characterized her. She requested adjustments to her on-call schedule, citing a temporary medical condition. She saved every possible penny. She called her grandmother in Croydon, explained the situation without revealing the father's identity, and received exactly what she expected: unconditional support. "A child isn't a problem, it's a blessing," Mrs. Zuleika said over the phone, with the simple wisdom of her 70 years. "If you've decided to have this child, she will have all the love in the world." Her belly began to grow discreetly under her loose lab coats. Colleagues noticed, speculated, but Louisa maintained a firm stance. "Yes, I'm pregnant. No, I won't discuss paternity. Yes, I'm finishing my residency. No, I don't need pity or gossip." In her rare moments of weakness, alone in her small Shoreditch apartment, she allowed herself to think of Richard. What would he say if he knew? Would he take responsibility or reject her again, now even more cruelly? The doubts gnawed at her, but her determination was greater. This child would be loved, cared for, protected, with or without the father's presence. St. Thomas Hospital was a different world from St. Francis. More chaotic, with fewer resources, serving a predominantly underprivileged population. Paradoxically, Louisa felt more at home there. The lack of glamour was compensated by a genuine sense of purpose. Each life saved represented a victory against the system that frequently turned its back on the most vulnerable. On a particularly hectic morning in the emergency room, while attending to a patient with heart failure, Louisa felt the baby's first kick. The sensation caught her by surprise, a physical, undeniable reminder of the life growing within her. For a brief moment, the chaos around them disappeared. There was only her and her child, connected in that intimate dance that only mother and baby know. "Everything all right, doctor?" asked the nurse, noticing her distant expression. Louisa smiled, returning to reality. "Everything's great. The baby just kicked me." That moment marked a turning point. The pregnancy, which until then had been a biological fact to be managed, transformed into something deeply emotional. During prenatal appointments, Louisa began talking to the baby, planning the future, dreaming of possibilities. The ultrasound revealed it would be a boy. Alone in the examination room, she had refused her grandmother's offer to accompany her. Louisa observed the black and white image, tears silently streaming down her face. "Any names in mind?" asked the obstetrician. "Michael," she replied without hesitation. "It means, 'who is like God,' a strong name for a boy who is already fighting from the womb." In the 7th month, a complication, elevated blood pressure, signs of preeclampsia. The obstetrician recommended immediate leave from work. For Louisa, it was like a blow. Her residency was her safe haven, her identity, but the baby's health came first. She accepted the medical leave and forced bed rest with resignation. Confined to her apartment, with occasional visits from her grandmother and a few close friends, Louisa found herself confronted with her own thoughts, her fears, her uncertainties. Richard's absence weighed more heavily now. In her darkest moments, she questioned her decision to keep him in the dark. Would it be fair to deprive Michael of his father? Would it be selfish to try to protect him from a family that could offer resources she never could? On a particularly difficult afternoon, she gave in to impulse. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Richard. "We need to talk about something important." Her finger hovered over the send button for several minutes. At the last instant, she deleted everything. No, it wouldn't be like that. Michael deserved more than a father forced to acknowledge him out of obligation. The birth came 2 weeks earlier than expected. Intense contractions woke her in the middle of the night. She called a taxi, phoned her grandmother on the way, and in less than an hour, she was at the public maternity ward attached to St. Thomas Hospital. Full dilation, elevated blood pressure. "We need to deliver this baby now," announced the on-call doctor, a colleague Louisa had worked with several times before. Labor lasted 8 hours. 8 hours of intense physical pain, but also of a deep spiritual connection with the life she was about to bring into the world. When Michael finally arrived, with a strong and healthy cry, Louisa experienced an emotion she had never imagined possible, an unconditional, visceral love that transcended anything she had ever felt before. "He's beautiful," the nurse said, placing the small bundle in her arms. "He has a dimple on his chin, just like yours." Louisa felt a tightness in her chest. The dimple wasn't hers. It was identical to Richard's, the first of many traits that would, inevitably, remind her of the absent father. The first few months with Michael were a roller coaster of emotions, the exhaustion of sleepless nights, the insecurity of every decision, the indescribable joy of every small achievement, the first smile, the first look of recognition, the first time he grasped her finger with his tiny hand. Mrs. Zuleika temporarily moved in to help, bringing with her the practical wisdom of someone who had raised children and grandchildren. "He has his father's gaze," the old woman commented one night, watching Michael asleep in the makeshift crib. Louisa stiffened. "How could you know?" "I don't know who the father is, my dear, but I've known you since you were born. That determined, almost defiant look isn't yours. It belongs to someone you haven't told me about yet." Maternity leave ended when Michael turned 6 months old. Returning to work was harder than Louisa had imagined. Every minute away from her son seemed like an eternity. The daycare near the hospital, though of good quality, never seemed enough. In between procedures, she would rush to breastfeed. On night shifts, she obsessively checked messages from the nanny. It was during this period of readjustment that Louisa realized how isolated she had become. Focused on daily survival, on single motherhood, on her demanding medical career, she had set aside friendships, relationships, social life. Her world now revolved exclusively around Michael and work. On a rare night off, browsing social media while the baby slept, she saw a news item about the Anderson Healthcare Group. Richard appeared in an official photo, alongside his mother, and an elegant woman Louisa recognized as Veronica, the ex-fiancée who had apparently re-entered his life. The announcement celebrated the group's expansion into the north, with the acquisition of a hospital network in Manchester. Richard smiled for the camera, the same rehearsed and empty smile she had learned to distinguish from the genuine smile he reserved for his private moments. "You look happy, Richard Anderson," she murmured to the screen, a pang of bitterness in her voice. "I hope it's worth it." Something in that moment, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps loneliness, perhaps the basic human need for connection, spurred her on. She opened her phone's camera, framed herself with Michael asleep in her arms. In the photo, her face displayed a serene, almost peaceful smile, contrasting with the inner turmoil that still frequently consumed her. She posted the image with a simple caption, "Life always finds a way to start anew." It was the first photo of Michael she had shared publicly. Until then, she had obsessively protected her son's privacy, avoiding exposure on social media. But that night, she felt the need to affirm her new reality, to celebrate the love that had transformed her life, even though it was born of deep pain. What Louisa couldn't foresee was that this simple photo, that moment of shared vulnerability, would be the trigger for a storm that was about to form. The image went moderately viral among her contacts, mainly college friends, some professors, hospital staff. Affectionate comments accumulated. "How lovely. I didn't know you'd had a baby. Congratulations, Dr. Louisa." For a few days, that small gesture brought a comforting sense of belonging, of community, something she had lost in the months of isolation. 3 days later, her phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was Marcia, her gynecologist friend. "Did you see who commented on your photo?" "What are you talking about?" Louisa asked, her voice hoarse with sleep, checking if Michael was still asleep in the crib beside her bed. "Edward Sutton, cardiac surgeon at St. Francis, commented on Michael's photo, and you know what's more interesting? He tagged Richard Anderson in the comment." Louisa felt her blood run cold. "What? Why would he do that?" The comment says, "What a handsome little boy, Louisa, a Richard Anderson. You need to see this. The resemblance is striking." "Oh my God." Louisa sat up in bed, her heart racing. "Delete the comment. Now. It's been over 12 hours. Richard has certainly already seen it." Louisa's mind went into a tailspin. She knew Edward superficially, a competent doctor, but known for hospital gossip. Apparently, speculations about her brief romance with Richard had never completely ceased. What do I do now? The question was more to herself than to Marcia. I think you need to prepare yourself. If Richard recognized his son in the photo, and let's face it, that dimple on Michael's chin is identical to his, he will come after you. Marcia's words proved prophetic. That same afternoon, while Louisa was organizing patient records in the pediatric cardiology outpatient clinic, a nurse approached her aunt, visibly nervous. "Dr. Louisa, someone is asking for you at reception." The woman hesitated. "It's Richard Anderson." The floor seemed to open beneath her feet. Louisa leaned on the table to keep from swaying. "Tell him I'm in a procedure, that I can't see anyone right now." "Doctor, he said he'll wait as long as it takes, and he looks determined." Louisa closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. This moment had always been on the horizon, the possibility that Richard would find out about Michael. Now that it had arrived, she felt strangely calm, almost resigned. Perhaps it was time to face what she had tried to avoid for so long. "Tell him I'll meet him in 20 minutes, in the third-floor cafeteria." She used those 20 minutes to compose herself. She changed her lab coat for a simple blazer she kept in her office, subtly retouched her makeup, and took several deep breaths. She called the daycare, checked that Michael was fine, and asked them to keep him there until further notice. Then, with firm steps that belied her inner turmoil, she headed to the meeting that could change everything. The cafeteria was almost empty at that hour. Richard occupied a table in the most discreet corner, his back to the entrance. Even from a distance, Louisa recognized the tension in his shoulders, the rigid posture he adopted in moments of extreme stress. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit, probably fresh from an important meeting. As she approached, he stood up abruptly, almost knocking over the untouched coffee cup in front of him. For an endless moment, they just looked at each other. Richard's face was pale, his eyes slightly red, as if he hadn't slept well in days. There were new lines of expression on his forehead, a hardness in his jaw that Louisa didn't remember. "The child in the photo," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "He's my son, isn't he?" Louisa held his gaze firmly. "Yes, Michael is your biological son." Richard closed his eyes for an instant, as if absorbing the impact of that confirmation, though he already knew the answer. When he reopened them, there was a mixture of emotions that Louisa couldn't fully decipher: anger, confusion, hurt, perhaps even relief. "Why didn't you tell me? Should I have told the man who loved me, or the man who dismissed me as a lapse in judgment? Which one are you?" "Richard." The question hit him like a physical blow. Richard recoiled slightly, his lips pressed into a tense line. "You had the right to be angry with me. You didn't have the right to hide my son." "Didn't have the right." Louisa felt the anger contained for months finally overflow. She kept her voice low, but every word came out laden with emotion. "You left me like discarding an inconvenient object. Your mother implicitly threatened me. What do you think would have happened if I showed up pregnant? Do you think I would have been received with open arms by the Anderson family? That your mother would offer me tea and biscuits instead of a lawsuit for extortion? That's not fair." "Fair?" A bitter laugh escaped. "You want to talk about fairness? I spent my entire pregnancy alone. I faced preeclampsia, almost lost my son, had to interrupt my residency. I gave birth with my 70-year-old grandmother as my only family by my side. Sleepless nights, painful breastfeeding, balancing work with single motherhood, all while you lived your perfect life, with your perfect relationship and your perfect empire. So don't talk to me about fairness, Richard." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Around them, a few people began to observe them discreetly, perhaps recognizing Richard, or sensing the electrifying energy emanating from the table. "How old is he?" Richard asked finally, his voice softer. 8 months and 2 weeks. "Is he healthy?" "Perfectly. He was born a little early, but he's developing normally." Louisa hesitated, then added, "He has your eyes, and the dimple on his chin." Something broke in Richard's controlled expression. A genuine emotion finally burst through the executive's mask, a vulnerability Louisa hadn't seen since those nights on the hospital rooftop. "I want to meet him," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Please, there was a plea in those words, a humility that caught Louisa off guard. She expected anger, threats, perhaps even mentions of lawyers and custody, not this genuine break, this raw openness. Why? What's changed, Richard? A year ago you decided we couldn't be together, that your perfect life was more important than any feelings between us. Now you want to be a father. Why? Richard took a deep breath, running his hands over his face in a gesture uncharacteristically careless for his standards. Because the photo of my son hit me like nothing ever has. Because ever since I saw that image, I haven't been able to think about anything else, eat or sleep. Because I understood, in 1 second, that nothing, absolutely nothing, in my supposed empire matters compared to the existence of that child. Louisa studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation, of falsehood. She found only exhaustion and a painful sincerity. And what about your mother, your fiancé, your carefully planned life? I don't know. The admission came out with difficulty. Honestly, I don't know how to deal with all of this. I just know I need to meet my son. I need to be a part of his life. Somehow, the request hung between them, laden with implications, possibilities, risks. Louisa could refuse. She could demand that any contact be mediated by lawyers. She could establish 1,000 barriers. Instead, she heard herself say, "He's at the hospital daycare. I can pick him up in an hour." The relief on Richard's face was palpable. "Thank you. This doesn't mean everything is fine between us. It doesn't mean I've forgotten or forgiven. It just means I won't deprive my son of the right to know his father. I understand. And if this is some kind of game, Richard, if you're thinking of using your money, your influence, or your mother to try to take Michael from me, I swear that—" "No." The interruption was firm. "It's not that. I swear on my life. I just want to meet him. I just want to do the right thing." Louisa nodded slowly. 1 hour, in the park across from the hospital. The meeting in the park was surreal. Richard, the impeccable executive, sat on a simple public bench, his eyes fixed on the entrance where Louisa would appear with her son, his son. The concept still seemed unreal, as if it floated around him without fully settling into his consciousness. When he finally saw them, the world seemed to pause. Louisa walked slowly, carrying a chubby baby dressed in a light blue romper. Even from a distance, Richard could see the dark, abundant hair, so similar to his own in childhood. He stood up, his legs strangely unsteady. The meeting he had imagined so many times in the last 48 hours was about to happen, and he suddenly felt completely unprepared. "Richard, this is Michael," Louisa said as she approached, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Michael, this is—" She hesitated. "Your father," Richard completed, his voice choked. "I'm your father, Michael." The baby stared at him with curious eyes, brown eyes identical to his own. The dimple on his chin deepened when the little one broke into an unexpected smile, almost as if he recognized something familiar in the stranger before him. "May I hold him?" Louisa hesitated briefly, then nodded, carefully transferring the baby into Richard's arms. The executive who commanded a billionaire empire, who made decisions involving millions daily, now held the tiny body with a mixture of terror and reverence. Michael studied him seriously for a few seconds, then smiled again, grabbing Richard's tie with a curious little hand. It was in that moment that everything changed, when that tiny being, half him, half Louisa, grabbed his expensive tie with absolute confidence, as if he had always belonged there. Richard felt something break inside him, an emotional dam he had kept intact for decades. Tears came without warning, silent, streaming down a face that rarely showed any emotion in public. "He's perfect," he murmured, his voice almost unrecognizable. Louisa watched the scene with a mixture of conflicting emotions. Seeing the man who had hurt her so deeply now holding their son, with such evident love, stirred feelings she thought were buried. "He's quiet most of the time," she said, breaking the emotional silence. "He only complains when he's hungry or sleepy. He likes music. Any melody calms him down immediately." Richard drank in every piece of information like a thirsty man. "How was the pregnancy? The birth? I'm so sorry I wasn't there." The conversation flowed surprisingly easily as they walked through the park. Louisa recounted the discovery of her pregnancy. the health complications, the first moments with Michael. Richard listened attentively, asking questions, absorbing every detail as if trying to fill in the lost months. For a few hours, the painful past, the hurts, the resentments faded into the background. There were just two parents getting to know each other through the child they had created together, albeit separately. As the sun began to set, Louisa checked her watch. "I need to take him home. It's time for his bath and his last feeding." Richard nodded, reluctant to say goodbye, but aware that there were limits he needed to respect. He carefully handed Michael back to Louisa's arms, feeling an immediate emptiness. "Can I see him again?" Louisa hesitated. "This is complicated, Richard. We can't just pretend the past doesn't exist. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a chance to be my son's father, somehow, in some arrangement that works for all of us." "And what about your life? Your relationship with Veronica? Your mother?" Richard sighed. "I don't know yet how to manage all of this, but I know Michael is my priority now. I need you to believe that." Louisa studied his face for a long moment. "Let's take it slow. You can see him twice a week for now, always with me present. No lawyers, no family, no complications." "Thank you," Richard said, his gratitude genuine. "I won't disappoint you this time." As she watched him walk away, his gait slightly less confident than usual, his shoulders a little less erect, Louisa wondered if she had made the right decision. Allowing Richard into Michael's life meant reopening wounds, risking new pains, facing a world she had tried to keep at bay. Still, as she looked at her sleeping son in her arms, she felt a strange certainty. For Michael, she would face any battle, even if it meant facing the man who had broken her heart again. What she didn't know as she returned home that night was that the true storm was yet to come, that the meeting in the park was just the prelude to greater confrontations, painful revelations, and choices that would test the strength of everyone involved. In his Belgravia penthouse, Richard stared at the city lit up through the panoramic window, his mind in a whirlwind. In his hands, he held an ultrasound photograph Louisa had given him, the first image of his son. Her words echoed, "No lawyers, no family, no complications." But he knew better than anyone. When it came to the Anderson family, complications weren't a possibility. They were a guarantee. The following weeks established an improbable routine. Twice a week, Richard would appear at Louisa's small Shoreditch apartment, a world away from his Belgravia penthouse. In the first few visits, the tension was palpable. Carefully neutral conversations, forced smiles, the awkwardness of two former lovers reunited by the child they had created. Gradually, something began to change. At first, they were small things. Richard showing up with medicine when Michael had colic, Louisa allowing him to feed the baby dinner. The first night the little one fell asleep in his father's arms, while he hummed a lullaby his own nanny had sung decades ago. I never imagined you singing lullabies," Louisa commented one night, watching him rock Michael with surprising naturalness. Richard smiled, his eyes fixed on his son. "I never imagined feeling what I feel for him. It's as if an entire universe has opened up inside me." The sincerity of the confession caught both of them by surprise. For a brief moment, their gazes met, not as cautious adversaries, not as hurt ex-lovers, but as two people united by a love greater than any resentment. The moment was interrupted by Richard's phone. The lit screen showed the name Mother in bold letters. "10th call today," he commented, silencing the device with a sigh. "She knows something's going on. I've been missing meetings, cancelling appointments." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing yet. I'm waiting for the right moment." Louisa stared at him with skepticism. "And when will this magical moment be? When I know exactly what I want to say? When I'm sure how to protect both of you?" The answer hung in the air between them, laden with implications. Protect? From whom? From Eleanor herself, obviously. The unspoken hovered like a dark cloud over the moments of peace they were building. The truth was that Richard lived in two parallel worlds. At the hospital and in the group's companies, he maintained his usual facade, the ruthless executive, the perfect heir, Veronica's convenient fiancé. But his heart was in the small Shoreditch apartment, with the son he was getting to know, and the woman who, despite everything, still stirred his deepest feelings. On a Tuesday morning, while finishing a video conference with international investors in his office, Richard received an unexpected message from Louisa. "Michael has a high fever. I'm at the children's emergency room at St. Thomas." Without a second thought, he abandoned the meeting in mid-sentence, leaving a virtual room of astonished executives. He drove his BMW like a madman through the congested streets of London, parking carelessly at the entrance of the public hospital. He found Louisa in the waiting room, her face etched with worry, Michael feverish in her arms. The baby cried softly, his little face red, his eyes scared. "What happened?" he asked, approaching quickly. "High fever started suddenly. The daycare called me." Louisa looked exhausted. "They've already taken samples. We're waiting for results and the pediatrician's assessment." Richard sat beside them, protectively putting his arm around Louisa without realizing the gesture. She didn't pull away either, her concern for their son overcoming any barrier between them. "Did you tell your grandmother?" "She's bedridden, caught a bad flu. I don't want to worry her unnecessarily. And your shift. I swapped with a colleague, but I have rounds tomorrow morning. I can't miss them." Richard gently squeezed her shoulder. "Don't worry about that now. I'm here." Louisa looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in a long time. Not the CEO, not the ex-lover, but the man genuinely concerned about his son, willing to abandon an important meeting to be there in a crowded public hospital waiting room. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. The following hours were of constant vigil. The tests revealed an infection, nothing serious, but it would require careful observation. Richard didn't leave their side for a single minute. He used his contacts to secure a private room, consulted specialists by phone, and personally fetched the prescribed medications. When they finally managed to take Michael home, it was past midnight. The baby, medicated and calmer, quickly fell asleep in his crib. "You should rest," Richard said, observing Louisa's deep, dark circles. "I can keep an eye on him." "You don't have to." "I want to stay. Please." Something in his voice, a mixture of determination and plea, made Louisa yield. She nodded silently and went to the bedroom, leaving the door ajar. She lay down dressed, planning only a brief rest. She woke with a start hours later. The apartment was silent. She got up in a panic, ran to the baby's room and stopped at the door, the scene before her freezing her in place. Richard was asleep in the nursing armchair, Michael nestled against his chest. Father and son breathed in the same rhythm, the same serene expression on their remarkably similar faces. On the small table beside them, organized medicines, an improvised spreadsheet noting medication times, temperature, hydration. Something broke inside Louisa at that moment. A resistance, a barrier she had kept up for months. The image of the two of them, the son who was her world and the man who, despite everything, still occupied a space in her heart, completely disarmed her. Silently, she picked up a light blanket and covered them both, allowing herself a moment of tenderness as she brushed a lock of hair from Richard's forehead. He opened his eyes slightly at her touch. "He's better," he whispered. "His fever broke around 3 in the morning." Louisa nodded, a lump in her throat. "You stayed awake all night?" "I wanted to be sure. I need to know he's okay." A pause. "That you both are okay." The plural didn't go unnoticed. The look they exchanged in the dim light of the nursery contained more than paternal concern. There was an unformulated question, a possibility they both feared to name. The following days intensified the proximity forced by Michael's illness. Richard practically moved into Louisa's apartment, sleeping on the sofa, taking turns with care, ensuring that no detail of his son's recovery was neglected. When Michael finally recovered, the established routine seemed too natural to be interrupted. The evenings in the living room, talking in low voices after the baby slept, the mornings sharing coffee before Louisa left for the hospital, the moments of renewed intimacy, an accidental touch, a lingering gaze, silent memories of a not-so-distant past. It was on one of those nights that Richard finally verbalized what they both felt. "I can no longer imagine my life without both of you," he said simply, his eyes fixed on the teacup in his hands. "I no longer want to pretend I can live divided between two worlds." Louisa felt her heart race. What exactly does that mean? It means I want to be present, completely. Not just a few hours a week, not as a visitor in my son's life, as a father, as... He hesitated. As the man who still loves you, who never stopped loving you. The confession hung between them, heavy, inevitable. Richard, nothing has changed. Your mother is still the same person. The Anderson empire still has the same demands. Veronica is still your official fiancée. Everything has changed. He looked at her with intensity. I have changed, or perhaps I have just found the courage to be who I always should have been. Words are easy. Then let me prove it with actions. He approached, gently touching her face. Louisa didn't pull back. When their lips met, it was as if time had rewound, the same connection, the same urgency, the same feeling of inevitability they had experienced on the hospital rooftop so many months ago. The kiss deepened, years of distance and hurt dissolving in the heat of the moment. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer. Louisa allowed herself, just for that instant, to believe again. It was Michael's cry through the monitor that brought them back to reality. They separated, breathless, their gazes fixed on each other. We need to talk about this, Louisa said, getting up to attend to their son. Really talk, Richard, about everything. He nodded, his eyes still dark with desire and emotion. Tomorrow, I promise. But tomorrow brought with it a storm. Richard had just left the apartment, promising to return that evening with a concrete proposal for their future. When Louisa's phone rang, it was Marcia, her gynecologist friend, her voice tense and hurried. Louisa, are you sitting down? You need to see this. A text message arrived immediately after, a link to a business gossip newspaper website. The headline was devastating. Anderson Empire heir has love child with resident doctor. Below, photos of Richard entering and leaving Louisa's building, a blurred image of Michael captured from a distance, distorted details about the previous romance between the two. How did this? Louisa could barely form the question, the shock paralyzing her reasoning. I don't know. But the report mentions sources close to the Anderson family. Louisa, this is on all the news portals. Before she could fully process the information, another call, the director of St. Thomas Hospital, requesting her immediate presence. The day turned into a nightmare. At the hospital, the director, visibly uncomfortable, mentioned undue exposure of the institution, conflict of interest, and need for temporary leave. In the corridors, curious glances and barely disguised whispers followed her. On her phone, dozens of unread messages, including several from Richard, increasingly desperate. When she finally managed to leave, she found reporters at the hospital door. She fled through the back, took a taxi to the daycare, and picked up Michael early. Upon arriving home, the building entrance was surrounded by more journalists. It was the doorman, Mr. Anthony, who saved her. Through the garage, Mrs. Miller, my nephew is waiting with the car to take you through the back. She took refuge in her grandmother's apartment in Croydon, her mind in a whirlwind. How had the story leaked? Who would have an interest in exposing them in this way? The obvious answer was too painful to contemplate. Richard appeared 3 hours later, his face transformed by anguish. Thank God you're safe. I was at your apartment when I didn't find you. It was her, wasn't it? Louisa interrupted, her voice trembling with contained anger. Your mother. Richard closed his eyes briefly. I have no proof, but yes. Probably. Did you tell her about Michael? No. I would never put you at risk like that. He ran his hands through his disheveled hair, a gesture of despair. But she's been monitoring me. She must have hired someone to follow me. She's always been... He hesitated. Ruthless, Louisa completed. They're calculating, manipulative. All that and more. Richard approached, trying to touch her arm, but she recoiled. Louisa, I'm going to fix this. I'm already taking steps. I've spoken with the press office, with lawyers. Lawyers? The word hit Louisa like a slap. Is that what this is about now, a legal battle? No, I'm just trying to protect your privacy, to ensure the exposure stops immediately. It's too late, the damage is done. Louisa held Michael tightly against her chest, as if she feared someone might snatch him from her at any moment. I've been suspended from the hospital, Richard. My professional reputation is compromised. My son is being called a love child in national headlines. And all because your mother can't stand the idea that the Anderson heir got involved with someone below her social standing. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. What can I do? Richard asked, his voice low, almost breaking. Tell me, and I will do it. Nothing. Louisa pulled away, tears finally escaping. We've done this dance before, Richard. You promise, your mother interferes, you back down. I won't subject Michael to this toxic cycle. I won't allow him to grow up in the middle of a family war. This time it's different. I am different. Prove it, not to me, to yourself. When Richard left Mrs. Zuleika's apartment, something had fundamentally changed in his expression. The hesitation, the inner conflict that had always characterized him when it came to his family, had given way to a cold, almost dangerous determination. The next morning, he convened an extraordinary meeting of the Anderson Healthcare Group's administrative board. The agenda: restructuring of family management and governance. The boardroom in the penthouse of the headquarters building in London's financial centre was full. Shareholders, directors, consultants, and, at the centre of the imported mahogany oval table, Eleanor Anderson, impeccable in her Chanel suit, observing her son with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Before we formally begin, Richard said, his voice surprisingly calm, I would like to make a personal announcement. Those present shifted in their chairs, the tension palpable. Everyone had seen the headlines, rumours had been circulating for days. As is already public knowledge, I have a 9-month-old son, Michael Miller Anderson, the result of my relationship with Dr. Louisa Miller. Richard kept his gaze fixed on his mother as he spoke. The leakage of this information to the press was coordinated by someone with privileged access to my routine and specific interests in harming my relationship with Louisa and our son. Eleanor didn't move, her expression impenetrable. A child's privacy was violated. The reputation of a brilliant doctor was stained, all for pettiness and control. Richard took a deep breath, controlling the anger that threatened to overflow. I will not tolerate this, not anymore. If you'll permit me, Richard, Eleanor interjected, her voice soft as poisoned velvet, no one here would doubt your paternal concern. The question is how this affects the family business, your position as a leader, your credibility. My credibility. Richard let out a humorless laugh. That's exactly what I'm defending, Mother. My ability to lead with integrity, to make decisions based on what is right, not what is convenient. And what would be right in your idealistic view? Eleanor abandoned the pretense of civility, her voice now sharp. Abandon everything we've built for generations for an affair with a doctor of questionable origin. Risk strategic alliances, like your marriage to Veronica, for cheap sentimentality. The silence in the room was absolute. No one had ever witnessed an open confrontation between mother and son. Family disagreements had always occurred behind closed doors. Questionable origin, Richard repeated, each syllable laden with indignation. Louisa's questionable origin includes sacrifice, determination, and academic excellence. She earned everything through merit, not inheritance or manipulation. And as for Veronica, he shook his head. There was never any love there, just mutual convenience, which she understood long before I did. He turned to the board, addressing each member individually. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not here to discuss my personal life. I am here to announce a professional decision. As of today, either this board accepts a complete restructuring of governance, severely limiting the presidency's influence on executive decisions, or I will submit my irrevocable resignation as CEO. The shock was visible on the faces around the table. Richard Anderson, a pillar of the group, threatening to abandon everything. You wouldn't do that, Eleanor whispered, the first time her composure seemed to waver. I already have. Richard slid a folder across the table, my resignation letter, effective immediately if the changes are not approved. And what's more, a proposal to sell my shares to the Sterling Group. The name of their biggest competitor dropped like a bomb in the room. Some board members gasped audibly. This is blackmail, Eleanor accused, her voice trembling. This is business, Mother. You taught me well. There's always a price for everything, isn't there? One of the oldest board members, Dr. Mendoza, cleared his throat nervously. I think it's prudent that we consider Dr. Anderson's restructuring proposal. After all, his leadership has been fundamental to the group's growth in recent years. Others nodded hesitantly. The fear of losing Richard to the competition was greater than any loyalty to Eleanor. Furthermore, Richard continued, I would like to announce another project, the creation of the Michael Anderson Foundation, dedicated to supporting medical residents from underprivileged communities and expanding pediatric cardiac care in underserved regions. Half of the dividends from my shares will be directed to this project. The meeting stretched for hours. Heated arguments, legal maneuvers, Eleanor's desperate attempts to reverse the situation. But Richard remained unshakable. In the end, the board conceded. The restructuring was approved by a narrow majority. Eleanor would retain an honorary position without effective powers. Richard would continue as CEO, but with governance mechanisms that would prevent family interference in strategic decisions. When everyone left, only mother and son remained in the now empty room. You destroyed everything I built, Eleanor said, her voice laden with resentment. No, mother, I saved what you built from your own obsession with control. Richard approached, observing for the first time the signs of age that the impeccable makeup could no longer completely hide. The empire continues, just not at the cost of my happiness, nor my son's happiness. Do you think this woman will make you happy? That this child will fill the void you've always carried? I don't know what will make me happy in the long run. I only know what will surely destroy me, continuing to live for the approval of someone who will never be satisfied. Eleanor lifted her chin, a gesture of wounded pride. And what if I refuse to accept this improvised family? If I never acknowledge this grandson? Richard smiled sadly. Then you will lose more than a position, mother. You will lose the chance to meet the most extraordinary person who has ever entered our lives. He left her alone in the boardroom, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. For the first time in decades, perhaps for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. Louisa's apartment was silent when he arrived, hours later. He found her on the small balcony, Michael asleep in his stroller beside her, the London sky dotted with few stars visible through the light pollution. It's done, he said simply, joining her at the railing. Louisa studied him in the dark, noting the lines of exhaustion on his face, but also something new, a serenity she had never seen before. What exactly is done? I confronted my mother, the board, the entire system that imprisoned me for years. He took a deep breath. I didn't resign, but I established clear boundaries. The Michael Anderson Foundation begins operating in 3 months, with you as medical director, if you accept. Louisa absorbed the information slowly. And Veronica? We officially broke up 2 weeks ago. To be honest, she seemed relieved. Your mother? She'll need time, perhaps a lot of time, or perhaps she'll never fully accept it. Richard touched Louisa's hand hesitantly. When she didn't pull back, he intertwined his fingers with hers. But that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what we want. You, me, and Michael. And what do you want, Richard Anderson? A chance. To be the father Michael deserves. To be the man you deserve. He leaned in, touching her face with his free hand, to build something real, honest, without shadows or secrets. Louisa closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar warmth of his hand. I'm scared, me too, but for the first time, my fear of losing you both is greater than any other. The kiss they shared then was different from all the previous ones. There was no desperate urgency like in their clandestine meetings at the hospital, nor the guilty hesitation of recent days. It was a kiss of new beginnings, of promise, of possibility. Michael chose that moment to wake up, letting out a joyful squeal upon seeing them both. They laughed, separating to attend to the little one, who stretched out chubby arms demanding attention. I think he approves, Richard joked, lifting his son into his arms. He's a baby. He approves of anyone who gives him biscuits, Louisa replied. But her smile betrayed the emotion she felt, seeing the two of them together. The following weeks were filled with adjustments, negotiations, small steps. Richard kept his word. No pressure, no rush. Louisa, initially reluctant, agreed to direct the foundation, imposing her own conditions, total independence, merit-based criteria for scholarship recipients, and a focus on truly underprivileged communities. The press eventually lost interest in the story. Other headlines, other scandals took their place in the news. Louisa returned to the hospital, now with special leave to balance her residency with the foundation's structuring. One sunny Sunday, 3 months later, marked another decisive moment. They were strolling in Hyde Park, Michael already attempting his first steps, clutching his parents' hands, when they spotted a figure sitting on a bench in the distance. Eleanor Anderson, without her usual makeup, without ostentatious jewelry, seemed smaller, almost fragile in the simplicity of a neutral-toned pant and blouse set. Richard felt Louisa stiffen beside him. "We don't have to do this now," he murmured. "No," Louisa replied, surprising him. "Summit will have to happen sometime. Better on neutral ground." They approached slowly. Michael, oblivious to the tension, babbled happily, trying to chase a duck that passed nearby. "Mother," Richard greeted formally. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on Michael. "He looks a lot like you at that age." "This is Michael," Richard said. "And this is Louisa Miller, his mother." "Dr. Miller," Eleanor corrected automatically. An old habit, always reinforcing hierarchies, titles, positions. "Louisa is sufficient," the young doctor replied, her voice surprisingly calm. An uncomfortable silence settled. Michael, sensing the change in atmosphere, clung to Louisa's leg, observing the stranger with curious eyes. "May I—" Eleanor hesitated, an unprecedented vulnerability in her voice. "May I see him up close?" Louisa and Richard exchanged a look. With a small nod, Louisa lifted Michael into her arms, approaching Eleanor. "Michael, this is your grandmother," she said softly. The word grandmother seemed to hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her eyes, normally cold and calculating, visibly welled up. When she hesitantly reached out to touch her grandson's little face, her hands, always steady, trembled slightly. Michael, unpredictable like any child his age, suddenly smiled at her. The same dimpled smile that had characterized the Andersons for generations. "Hello, little one," Eleanor whispered, her voice almost unrecognizable in its tenderness. Something changed in that instant. Not a complete reconciliation, not an immediate forgiveness. Deep wounds take time to heal, and some never heal completely. But a beginning, a possibility. Months later, the inauguration of the Michael Anderson Foundation brought together important figures from medicine and business. The headquarters, strategically located near underprivileged communities in East London, contrasted with the usual opulence of the Anderson Group's facilities, functional, welcoming, without unnecessary ostentation. Louisa, in her first public speech as director, presented a vision for a more egalitarian healthcare system. Richard Danners, by her side, announced partnerships with public universities for the training of pediatric cardiology specialists. In the front row, a surprise for many, Eleanor Anderson, applauding discreetly. The relationship with her daughter-in-law and grandson was still delicate, built on small cookout supervised visits, cautious conversations. But it was there, a genuine effort, perhaps the first in her life, to adapt instead of control. After the ceremony, journalists surrounded the couple. "Dr. Anderson, when will the wedding be?" asked a reporter, pointing to the discreet engagement ring on Louisa's hand, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, chosen together, without the typical Anderson ostentation. "When we find time in our impossible schedules," Richard joked, embracing Louisa by the waist. "But probably before the Foundation's first anniversary." "Dr. Miller, do you intend to take the Anderson surname after marriage?" Louisa smiled. "I think Michael has enough Anderson for all of us. I prefer to keep my professional identity as it has always been." The answer, which months earlier would have scandalized London's high society, now seemed natural, appropriate. The world was changing, even in the most traditional circles. Later that night, alone in the penthouse they now shared in Belgravia, a middle ground between the very different worlds they came from, they reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 2 years. "If someone had told me, that night, on the hospital rooftop, that we would be here now." Richard shook his head, still incredulous at the twists of fate. "We would have had to go through hell first," Louisa reminded him, leaning back against his chest as they watched the city lit up through the window. It was worth every second. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. I wouldn't change a thing if the end result was this moment. In the next room, Michael slept peacefully, surrounded by simple toys and some very sophisticated ones, a gift from his grandmother, who was slowly learning to show affection without control. On his wall, a framed photo, him newborn in his mother's arms, with the same caption that had changed everything. Life always finds a way to start anew. Louisa turned in Richard's arms, looking into those eyes that still made her feel the same electricity as their first encounter. You know what's most extraordinary? How something as small and fragile as a baby can have more power than a billionaire empire. The power of love surpasses the power of money, Richard replied, touching her face with reverence. It took me a long time to learn that, but now I will never forget it. The kiss they shared sealed not only the promise of a future together, but the certainty that some battles, no matter how painful, are worth every scar they leave. That some loves are too strong to be denied, even when the whole world seems to conspire against them. And that, as the caption of that photo that changed their lives said, life always finds a way to start anew. And so, among the skyscrapers of a London that never sleeps, an improbable love transformed not only two wounded hearts, but an entire family legacy, not erasing the past, but building a future where the power of affection finally surpassed the power of money and social conventions. The next morning, as the rising sun painted the horizon golden, Michael woke his parents with laughter and joyful squeals. Louisa and Richard welcomed him into bed, forming that kind of perfect moment that no fortune can buy. 3 hearts beating in sync, 3 lives intertwined by destiny, by chance, and by that mysterious and powerful force that some simply call love.